weird thing where like you can record transitions and stuff. So because I'm going to be using fun effects, it means that they will only appear on that screen and I won't have a recording. But that's totally fine because I really like just making extra work for myself. So I'm just going to fine. Not a problem at all. And then the final thing, whether or not this works. Huzzah! All right, cool. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Jackson, way! Right. All right, hi everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and it's just great to be back with the truth. My talk is about process mapping and empathy, and let's begin. So, who am I? I am Richard Jackson, and I go by Jax or Jaxor on most of the social media things. Normally I'd have a more professional photo, but this was taken of me at 5 o'clock this morning, and I just thought it was really cool, so there we go. So I'm a cloud software engineer at a startup called Nightingale HQ. It's me and 2 other people, and I have just finished my placement. I've just finished a year there, and I'm about to start my dissertation, which is moving their website from Hugo to Umbraco. So that's going to be what I'm going to do for the next 12 weeks. Beware, there will be talks about that probably. I have really only been interested, I've been interested in Umbraco since last year. Pretty much I've given talks about why. Primarily it's because people I respected Umbraco, pretty much. Everyone was cool. If I liked them, they would typically tell me good things about Umbraco, and so here we are. And I've been a professional musician since 2010, and I'm now retraining into tech, so that's kind of the dual life that I currently live. So what is this talk about? Using process mapping to build empathy to improve working environments. Basically, how we can combine process mapping with empathy, emotional intelligence, to just make our lives easier, moreover to improve workplace environments and how we get along in general. So this is a work in progress idea. It's I'm very much working through it, so this is the first iteration, so I'm very welcome to feedback, but this is far from academic or conclusive. So where did this idea come from? In April, I did a presentation to a European agency called Strada. It's Strada Women in Manufacturing. It was about getting entrepreneurial women of Europe into the manufacturing sector and supporting them with that. And so as part of a module called Leading Digitalization, I gave a talk on process mapping. At the same time, a month later, at Umbraco London, I gave a talk which was about my first 12 months of .NET, Azure, and Umbraco, and in that I talked about a lot of what I've learned from being in the tech community, and I had a big old chapter about empathy, compassion, generally being nice to one another, and that's led us to here, this combination of those 2 talks. So I'm just going to take both of those presentations and put alternating slides in the middle of it. So there is going to be slightly more logic to it, I promise you. I knew it! Hi, it's my face. I don't know why that's there, just for this one slide. I turn it off by doing this, but I don't.
Seen this before?
No, that's really cool.
Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, right. So this is in Microsoft PowerPoint, and so basically this is part of the recording functionality. So you can do this, and like, because I did this for the process mapping talk, and then had to do voiceovers. So it's like, hi everyone, my name is Richard Jackson. We're going to learn about.
Oh yes.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Just FYI.
It's not going to record.
Yeah, it's not like my phone.
Really good imitation.
I've deep faked myself as one guy. All right. Why am I here? I am not here.
You could have kept it for the rest of your presentation.
No, it's only on this one slide, and I cannot tell you why. This was the sort of tech issues I was having just before I started. Anyway, point being, why am I here? Twitter. Because basically, I posted about the fact that I did this talk about process mapping, and then Matt was like, love the sound of that, and I was like, do you want to give a talk at Umbraco Bristol? And I was like, sure. How about July 12th? And if you check your calendars, that's roughly today.
Organisation 101 day.
100%. It's all about networking online and being addicted to social media. What does this have to do with Umbraco? Absolutely nothing. But it's generally just kind of a nice starting point. But to compromise, I will have an Umbraco fact. Here's my Umbraco fact. Umbraco uses the tagline, the friendly CMS.
That's a great fact.
Who coined this?
Is it the CEO?
Who said, okay, vote. Who coined the term, the friendly CMS for Umbraco?
I reckon it's the CEO.
I think one of the founders of Umbraco CMS.
What's the name?
I'm going for Niels.
I think Niels.
Going for Niels?
Niels, yeah.
That's a
It
safe.
was Niels or it's one of the 2.
Fair enough. It was, drumroll please, Hudson Moore.
Who?
Who is Hudson Moore, says Umbraco London and Umbraco Bristol. I have no idea. I straight up cannot find any details about Hudson Mall, except that if you go to the Umbraco website where it says our core values, it says Hudson Mall, one of the initial designers of like one of the sketches in 2006, just said, "Oh, he's quite friendly, we do friendly stuff." And that is the only reference to him on the internet that I can find. LinkedIn, Twitter, I stopped there. But that was it. I cannot find the existence of
You
the
too
person.
much stuff, you know.
No, I do suspect it's an anagram of Umbraco in Danish, but my Danish is not good enough. Right, so apparently next year my talk is going to be the hunt for Hudson Mall, which has definitely got the kind of vibe that we require. So, process mapping and required XKCD, otherwise it is not a talk. So, what is process mapping? Just for clarity of understanding. Process mapping is the creation of a visual representation of work. A communication exercise defining workflow, resource, and responsibility. And just to kind of finish that up, it's a high-level, non-technical document which should be understandable across the business. So, what have we got here? Basically, a process map is any way that I can draw something which represents what I do to you. And moreover, it should be accessible, understandable, and actually just usable by anyone across the business.
We used to call these flowcharts.
So these are flowcharts. This is a particular type, which is why the previous slide was a guide to understanding flowcharts. But the point being, there are loads of different types of process maps. So this is just one of them. If you talk to any project manager, which I'm not, then there are like over 10 different kinds and all these sort of things. I'm using the flowchart just because that's a useful thing. But a flowchart is a process map. It's a way of describing that. So it's kind of a means to an end rather than this is just about flowcharts, which also it kind of is. But there is a difference between process mapping and process modeling, which I just want to kind of highlight just in case anyone was not aware. A process map on the left, high level and subjective. It's a way we describe, do the thing, do the next thing, this thing goes to here, blah, blah. And it's meant to be high level, and it's also very, very subjective. It's how we would describe a task. Meanwhile, a process model is literally naming classes, naming how the actual programmers work, the code, so that in itself is very low level and objective, like that is correct, like that is the name of that function, like there can be no dispute about that. It could be named better, but that's the name of it. But we're mainly going to be focusing on this process mapping, also because I only learned that process modeling was a thing 2 days ago, and I'd already written this talk, so I'm just going to acknowledge that exists and move on very quickly. And also, my name is on the diagram that I used because I found it on the internet. Look, top left of this process model, R. Jackson, and that is me. And I don't know why I'm now customer 1 on the internet, but there we go. That's nice to be immortalized. Okay, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this is a statistician, George Box, who basically pointed out that there will never be a perfect representation of anything, especially when we're talking about models, maths, representations. But that does not mean they don't have value. Something can be imperfect yet useful. And it's that kind of notion that's really, really important when we talk about process mapping, especially when we get to the points of really quibbling over minor details. The ultimate point is that it has value, and that's where it ends. That's the point. So, the next part of this is where we talk about empathy. So, empathy is feeling for someone, the idea that I know what you are going through, that I can understand your position, that I get you. Meanwhile, just for reference, compassion is then wanting to do something about it, just for your own interest. It's compassion is basically defined as empathy plus. So just in general, there are loads of different theories of empathy, but there are this particular one I particularly like, there are 3 different types. So we've got cognitive empathy, the I put myself in your shoes, the emotive empathy, I feel, so again, sort of more from an emotional perspective, and then the empathic action, which I hate the fact that's on white on yellow, so apologies to any accessibility experts. I will just help you, or I will stand and acknowledge that without actually trying to fix the thing. There's a whole thing of overbearing, we want to be the ones fixing it, but actually help is a slightly different thing entirely. And I personally believe process mapping is super, super useful at this I put myself in your shoes to help us put ourselves into other people's shoes. So if you write a map I am able to understand better what you're going through. I am able to see, oh, okay, so this was here. All right, so you were late because you had to get parking in Bristol, and then you got trapped outside a door because you didn't understand where the actual address was. So suddenly I can empathise rather than where was Rich, which may or may not have happened half an hour ago. I think also process maps are kind of helpful with feeling as well, and they're sort of helpful in terms of starting off discussions. I think this is kind of an interesting one. I want to recognise and clearly define what your problems are without actually being the one to fix it. And I think, again, process mapping, when you're actually just writing out flowcharts, like, okay, let's just be very clear on all of the steps here, can really help to lead those kind of conversations and start discussions. So, a couple of things about how we improve empathy if that's not a thing we're particularly strong at, which is completely fair. So, 3 general tips, 3 general starting points. The focusing on the person's how and why. How are they doing the thing? Like, if I'm working with a colleague and I just don't understand, like, okay, how are they approaching this problem and why are they doing it in that kind of way? That's a really, really useful starting point to build up a rapport with how they're viewing things. Ask them if they want help. The classic of just steamrolling over and just fixing the thing because it's quicker. Especially, I mean, from my shoes as being a junior, as being only 1 year in this industry, quite frankly, there's always this sense of needing to fail a little bit and needing to be able to ask for help instead of just going like, oh no, here's how you do it. And it's like, while it's nice and gets results and there's a time and place for that, of course, deadlines do exist, it's also useful to bear that in mind. And then the third one, to offer suggestions, not answers. It's that kind of thing, again, guided sort of question, guided sort of instruction. And for process mapping, I personally think a lot of this is about focusing and understanding those hows and whys. I think that can be very clearly illustrated through that. This is a wonderful set of charts that I saw. So Ernst & Young did a survey of empathy in a business survey. So this is specifically more about from leadership and how it builds around in terms of companies. And so we're talking, basically huge amounts of people believe that empathy between leadership and those who are in the company increases stuff like efficiency, job satisfaction, creativity, idea sharing, innovation, which is all great, it's all really, really good. But my favorite thing is my company's efforts to be empathetic are dishonest. And the fact that that has increased. So, and then to the other side, my company doesn't follow through on the promises they make to employees. So I'm very mindful that increasingly, as there is sort of an empathic, let's be nice movement, you have to actually believe it, otherwise people will not trust you, and that's much more damaging. So I just thought that was particularly
Sorry, is it getting worse? Is that?
Yes. So that's saying in 2021, the number of people who went for my company's efforts to be empathetic are dishonest was at 46, and that has now gone up to 52 over the past 2 years. So it's actually quite interesting in terms of like social norming of kind of mental health care and that kind of like soft skills that actually there isn't a lot of, but there is decreasing belief that that is actually true. And I think that's a really funny thing from a leadership perspective. It's not like, so if I say that I don't get you, if I look deep in your eyes and say I do care, that doesn't actually mean anything unless you actually follow through. So I just think whenever we talk about empathy, we also have to talk about trust and not just like messing people over, because that's very, very easy. I think it's really, really easy to confuse niceness with naivety. Like, just caring does not mean that you are ignorant of abuse, for example. It's just a pet peeve of mine. Process mapping and empathy. Hey, it's the name of the talk. Okay, so this is where we actually talk about how we actually combine these two things. We've got 5 little steps here that I think are really, really interesting in terms of the combination of process mapping and empathy. Specifically, a process map is going to really, really help with communication and transparency. Again, we're talking about the understanding, being in my shoes. If we have a diagram, you can understand, you can have patience, etc. Documenting and codifying. Actually, I think this is a really underrated part. One of the fun parts about process mapping is giving stuff names. And especially when we have large companies, cross-departmental things, it's useful, hey, that thing you do, that bit, to actually give it a name is actually really, really invaluable for conversation, because then it helps you build up your business glossary and means that you actually have a set of terms. And God help, you might even have unique terms across a business, but we can't get too far with that. Learning and onboarding, again, this is my personal thing. I think process maps are the best thing in terms of learning. And I'll talk about this shortly in more depth, because it's not just about seeing a process map, but also getting the new starters to make one. Because then you can see what they understand. It's like, actually, that's, okay, I see why you think that would happen, but actually it's this. Talk about that shortly. Discussion and iteration. The idea that process maps give you that basis of conversation. The whole thing, it's a sheet of paper or a set of post-it notes or whatever, and then you can talk about, why do we do that? Genuinely one of the bits of work I did was helping a company with some process mapping, and I got people in a room not like this and not too dissimilar to this, and just basically said, like, as we're going through all the documents, like, well, we print off all of these things. We thought you guys needed it. It's like, no, we haven't needed that for like 4 years. Like, well, I guess we're going to stop doing that then. And it's crazy just within like a conversation that was immediately resolved, and we're talking about, again, genuinely thousands of pieces of paper because that's the particular company this was in. So again, good basis for discussion and for improvement of business processes. And patience and understanding. Again, I think this is my key one. I personally find it much easier to understand why somebody is acting the way they are if I actually know what they've had to go through to get there. And if there's a particular blocker, if they're just like, oh, this thing's causing me problems, like, okay, fine, and then the next day it's still causing me problems. And process mapping can just be a way of breaking that down, again, with a kind of common, high-level way that anyone can express an opinion. So, my favorite meme, new employee wears documentation, team leads say, I am the documentation. And the idea that the instructions only come from these hilariously this may or may not just be a recurring dream of mine, that may or may not be a thing I have to breathe another council, but that's by the way. The point being here is this idea that it can be quite intimidating, especially for new starters, to actually know how stuff works. Yeah. And the number of times you have to ask the same questions. And I feel, again, while I don't have evidence for this in any sort of way, so it's entirely conjecture, but it's both tiring for the manager and tiring for the person who has to ask. And so again, this is kind of why I argue on the side of documentation. Callum White, quite openly, says the best documentation is the code base. And to an extent I agree, but when I think about starting off, I think when you're a junior, just looking at a code base is a terrifying thing, especially if it's quite a large one. And so again, why I think high-level overviews are really, really useful to defeat that. Process maps and communication. So this is just a bit of advice in case anyone hasn't particularly thought of this kind of stuff. In my humble opinion, process maps, any type of writing out of how any process works out should be accessible across a business. I should be able to see anyone's processes, not my own department, just the entire company's. I think there's quite a lot that can be gained from that sort of transparency of seeing where our own work fits into things, seeing, again, understanding what that other person is trying to achieve, what that other department is trying to achieve. That is not to say you can assume, oh, well, I saw this, so I changed everything. This is the basis of communication. This is not the be and the end all. I'm not advocating huge changes for that. Ensuring access for all. And there are just very basic things like a business process template, which is what I've got on the left. That's just a free one I found from a site called Bridging the Gap, I believe. They're just formalized documents which list out, name, what the inputs, the outputs, the purpose, the entry criteria, success, failure of processes. And that's where you would put your process map. So again, you would have a one singular place where people would put these things so that you could view it. In my ideal world of communication and transparency, codifies process for cross-business discussions. Thank you, me. Process maps for onboarding. I think it's really, really useful to have them for new starters. I think they're really, really useful to just have in general. But I also, as I said earlier, I think they're a really good exercise. After a month of being in a business, okay, explain to me how this works. Just take some, bits of paper, just draw out, okay, so we've built this API. How does the OAuth 2 work? How does the authorization, how does this, what happens when these things? Describe it to me. And this gives a very simple way to measure understanding, to ask questions, to go oh, actually, this works this way. And again, it feels like to me personally, it feels like quite an underutilized learning tool, and gives a basis for discussions and further research. Because if we look at our good friend Richard Feynman, the physician, American physician, he has this idea of the learning, which is basically you find something you're interested in, you pick a bit of it, you learn about that, you explain it to somebody else, and then you work out what you didn't know, and you just kind of continue that circuit. So we choose a concept, we research it, we explain it. Are there any gaps in it? And if there are, then we go back to actually researching it. Whoops, I did mess up that arrow. Apologies. And then we review it and simplify it, and then of course we sell it as a Udemy course. But I think this is a really, really good step for using process mapping, the explanations in general, and also I think the actual final review and simplifying it is where process mapping really comes in. Again, when we're talking about this formalized documentation, that final step. I think this kind of the good for process mapping bit, this is the worst laser ever. Anyway, this bit, the good for process mapping, that's lovely for working stuff out. But again, for the actual codifying, the actual setting in stone, that's a really, really useful step in my humble opinion. And then very finally, process maps for patience and understanding. We understand, I would argue that we would have more patience for blockers and patience for things which are getting us stuck, which is a blocker, if we understand what's going on behind it. And again, I don't just mean within our teams and our daily stand-ups or anything like that. I mean cross-business. Again, I primarily work in the manufacturing sector. We work for digitizing manufacturers, and we're talking lots about dealing with our deliveries to our welders, to our detailers, etc. And just having a little more cross-departmental empathy, just going like, oh, why is it taking so long? It's like this bit, and being able to have that as better, as a more open bit of internal data, I think is quite useful. Process maps help to communicate where blockers are most prominent. Basically what I said, just helps you to identify that properly. And like I said, it's not just your own department, but it's across department as well, I feel, across business. I'm really big on this kind of cross-business communication. I think teams are quite good, but I really generally think there should be more transparency. So, in conclusion, confusion can be resolved by process maps. Process maps can provide clarity. Clarity leads to empathy. Empathy leads to happiness. Happiness leads to Umbraco! That is my tie-in for Umbraco, this particular thing. But the idea that a lot of issues can be resolved through communicating, through writing stuff down, through in a high-level way which you can understand. Finally, my perennial message is tech is hard, and to be excellent to each other. And that, thank you for listening. Here's my flowchart of how Q&A works.
Yes.
So let's do that.
So we are running behind our
sorry.
schedule, but if it's okay with everyone, we can just stand like 5-10 minutes for questions if there are any.
Is that okay with anyone?
Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, got
Okay.
5. Yeah.
Any questions, please?
First, I want to preface this by saying I actually love all of the ideas he's talking about me saying, so I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. But with kind of the process mapping across the business, and I know that you kind of addressed this with your iteration, do you run the risk of, for example, someone who can work with a specifically better process individually, whereas the whole team wants a different process, of kind of people misunderstanding the use of this and then kind of making standardized processes that kind of stifle innovation of certain members of the group who maybe can address things a little bit differently?
It depends
effectively.
Sorry, apologies. Yeah, that's totally fair. I think it depends if you see process mapping as being anti-innovation, and I don't think I understand why. Could you explain that bit?
So it's more the idea, I think that like if you do it the right way and you do the iteration, like you say, in the building on it, then that's obviously it resolves that problem to an extent. I think it's more the idea that people maybe misuse that concept, create a few processes that they then set in stone across the business, then that doesn't work for certain individuals in the business, even if it works at a team whole, and those individuals then feel stifled in their own specific.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess my crass response is, if stuff is used badly, then yes.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and I think ultimately any sort of codifying, any sort of formally documenting this needs some kind of approval process, needs some kind of sign-off, needs some kind of tech lead or manager to approve it. It can't just be anyone going, this is this random thing I do. Yeah, I guess that's what we do in the future. So I take your point, but I also think that's a completely reasonable problem that companies would need to address in how they do this.
Sure.
The only point that I get to is just I think process maps, if anything, are pro-innovation because I think they help you to look at what you're currently doing and question that further. So even if one person is doing it in a particular way, you can compare and go like, wait, why is Aaron doing it that way? Oh, you can't. That does just work. Okay, cool. And then you can use that as the basis of improvement rather than stifling it.
Sure.
Yeah, that would kind of be that answer.
Yeah,
give my thought.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, definitely.
Please.
So I understand there are different types of process
Oh, sure.
mapping, right? So one is probably the professions. Like within a company, like what does a software developer
for sure.
do, right? So that's one process mapping for it. And also, you have process mappings for the actual projects, right?
Yes, sure.
In that case, I mean, who should write, for example, the ones for the roles, and who should write the process mappings for the actual projects?
That's a totally fair question. And again, I would just kind of similar answer. It's down to the business. It's down to, I'm not going to prescribe that. I think it would work differently for different organizations. Yeah, and to your point, I think a failing of this is to only really focus on the flowchart element, where there are loads of different types of process. But to focus on specifically flowchart, yeah, I think ultimately it's down to who best understands that, or also who has the ownership, sorry, I'm literally stuck on this word, but who is the owner of that particular area? And it really, again, sticks with them to have an approval, maybe have like a secondary, unrelated person who can scrutinize it further.
Yeah, maybe the first bit could be written by someone from the HR.
Yeah.
Right, because it's all about
Fun fact. I'm so sorry to go. One of the golden rules of process mapping is to not get HR to do it. Process map should be done by the people who are in that, who are using it every day. This is honestly one of the key golden, and I fall foul of this all the time. Like, again, I've been brought in to write process maps for other people. It should be done by the people who are doing those processes, because otherwise it's a second hand, I think this is how you're doing. And yeah, there's a time sink to it, of course, that's the same with any documentation. But yeah, 100% should be done entirely within the team as part of the documentation.
I think for the projects, I've been reading this book. It's called Extreme Programming.
Sure.
I don't know if you have any of you if you have heard about it. It's a
I'm
very
not
good book.
extreme, so-
And one of the key principles is to not to spend a lot of time on the documentation.
Yeah, sure.
Because your clients, they all read it. They care about
Yeah.
the actual artifacts, which are the products. So they don't want you to spend a lot of time on documentation. So for that reason, I think we can all write good quality code, and then we can use some tools to create the documentation for them.
100%.
I think that could be like a nice solution.
I think that's absolutely reasonable, and I think that's always the element. Like, documenting doesn't innately create value, and that's always the kind of the battle of documentation, isn't it? Or the fact that we're not talking about the value now, we're talking about the value in a year, we're talking about the value when you, the developer who made that code, leaves.
I guess as well, you can use tools like GitHub Copilot and stuff nowadays to write comments quickly to it.
Alright.
And document stuff a lot more easily, can't you? So these
I think there are options. Yeah.
Yeah, there are many ways of doing it. So yeah.
Any more questions? Okay, no more questions. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you so much.